Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bolton of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. David Litt is a former speechwriter for President Obama, head writer for Funny or Die, and the author of a fantastic new book, It's Only Drowning, a true story of learning to surf and the search for common ground. The book is a hilarious account of his years spent learning to surf with his vaccine skeptic, Rogan-loving brother-in-law. We talked about how surfing gives us insight into some of our nation's biggest political and cultural divides, why it's more important than ever that Democrats are funny, how to use humor and authenticity to connect with audiences, and what happens when a teenage surf instructor diagnoses your deepest fears. Enjoy. David Litt, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thank you for having me.
I gotta say, I've loved all your books, but the most recent book, It's Only Drowning, the story of learning to surf and the search for common ground, resonated, not only because there was a whole chapter about my hometown here in Santa Cruz, but because I thought it was a wonderful exploration of craft and travel and culture and politics and with a lot of humor. I can't recommend it highly enough. And so congratulations on such a important work.
Thank you. Okay. I feel like this interview's over. We're good. I think we've covered everything, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. And wrap. So, I mean, I think one of the things I was most surprised about is you wouldn't think surfing would be a great lens to sort of discuss our cultural and political divides, but it turns out to be a really good way to do it. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose surfing as the way to discuss these broader topics?
Well, Ryan, I was about to say what I think might be the most pretentious thing I've ever said in my life, which is I didn't choose surfing. Surfing chose me. And now having disclaimed that, it's kind of true. I had no plans whatsoever to write a book about surfing, let alone think about, is surfing going to help me rethink my relationship to fear, to the world, to my work, to friendships. And yet, as you know, as a surfer, right, is once you start, suddenly you're like, oh, it's like something has been unlocked. And yeah, at first it was almost the opposite, right? What unlocked was like muscle soreness I did not know existed. But I started surfing, at the advanced age of 35, which, as you know, maybe some of your listeners know, right? That's the rough equivalent of taking up guitar lessons on your deathbed. Right? You're not recommended really to start that old, but I did, and it was incredibly difficult. And I'm so glad that I didn't quit. I thought about it a bunch of times, but gradually I started to say to myself, okay, I'm embarrassing myself a lot, so that's funny, and I'm learning a lot, so that's interesting. And those two things came together, and I started saying, well, that feels like a book. This was not meant to be a book, but it turned out to be a book I'm really glad that I got to write.
And I thought one of the interesting things is, surfing could be seen as a coastal thing, and the coastal divide that exists. But you identify that surfing really has these sort of two competing cultures. Like one is the sort of Spicoli community, we're all out on the waves. It's zen and cool. And the other one is all the surfers who, like, if there's three people out in a morning, the whole morning's ruined and it's terrible. And it's about individualistic and rugged individualism.
Right.
And
I'm sure in Santa Cruz, you all know nothing about grumpy locals.
So, nothing.
But you've heard stories. Yeah.
Yeah. The Pleasure Point knife fighters are alive and well. But and you and your brother-in-law, Matt, who are the main characters in this book, really um, are symbolic of that divide. And can you talk a little bit about that and how it's maybe a proxy for what we see in our politics?
Yeah, it's interesting to me. So obviously, I used to be a speechwriter for President Obama. I'm a lifelong Democrat. And especially these days, I think people sometimes say, what makes you a Democrat? And it's always, for me, comes back to fighting for people on the outside, and also this sense of doing things together. Right. I mean, that those are, I think, traits that are pretty common, and they're not partisan, but I think those are, generally speaking, you hear that frequently, for example, from President Obama or from other leaders in the Democratic Party. And I think, Matt is not a hardcore Republican by any means. I mean, he's actually never registered to vote, but I think he represents a very different American tradition, which is he is a real rugged individualist. And one of the things I say in the book, I was talking about in New Jersey where we were surfing, Lock Arbor, which is a break I like a lot, kind of good for longboards. There's not a ton of really good longboard breaks in Jersey. And one of the things I liked about it was that there was a real sense of community. And where I saw community, Matt saw it as a crowd. But I will also say that I think this is really a book about two people who on paper have nothing in common, learning from each other. And one of the things I learned from Matt is to appreciate those moments when it's like, oh, the waves aren't good, and that means there's no crowd. And instead of being like, well, let's focus on the fact the waves aren't good, to be like, hey, this is great. I get to be out there, alone or with, one other person in the ocean, and I got the place to myself. And I think it's changed my attitude as well. So I think, and I think in the same way that so much of this ends up being metaphorical, I think that is certainly true in my surfing. And it's changed the way I think about politics and life.
Yeah, and let's dive into that politics and life, because you were on NPR and the New York Times, and you've talked about it's not about necessarily about finding common ground, but about finding neutral ground. And you talk about the differences between the two, especially at this moment.
Yeah, I think common ground we usually mean, are we going to agree about big, important national issues? And there might be more of that out there than we think, but we're pretty divided as a country. And the reason it feels like we're divided is that we're divided, right? We have really deep disagreements, and they're not just matters of opinion, right? I mean, I think that's very important, that I see a lot of these things, and I know many of your listeners do, and also many people around the country. These aren't just matters of opinion, they're matters of right and wrong. And the tricky thing about democracy is people can say that and take opposite sides of the same issue. So you have to figure out how to resolve that. And one of the ways that I think we can come closer to resolving it, try to find a way forward, is to focus on what I think of as neutral ground, which is things that aren't coded one team or another, right? Starting with these basic things that, a lot of hobbies, oftentimes spent outdoors, these things that just allow us to spend time with other people who have very different views than we do, very different ways of seeing the world than we do, because I think that leads to this foundation of mutual respect. Not necessarily respect for every one of someone's ideas, but respect for them as a person, and this willingness to be curious and to learn. And when you have that, it doesn't change everything in life, right? There's no magic wand, but it creates the conditions where change can start to occur. And it means that it's a lot harder for demagogues to demonize us, right? To turn people against each other. They'll still try, but it makes their job harder instead of easier.
Yeah, there's a moment where your brother-in-law is like, wow, if you ran for Congress, I might even consider voting for you. That'd be a great thing. And it's like this really touching moment in the book of how there is a possibility to find connection. And you point out that your brother-in-law concerns about COVID vaccines, listens to Joe Rogan, and that you tried to connect with them through understanding those concerns or listening to Rogan episodes. And I mean, I think maybe if you're listening to this podcast, you're not spending a lot of time listening to Rogan, so we can use you as an entry point. But like, what do the Democratic Party need to learn from those worlds that you connected through your brother-in-law?
One of the biggest things I think Democrats can learn is that Rogan and what I think of is almost like the Joe Rogan cinematic universe. These are not hosts who thought of themselves as political, and they still don't. Right now, you or I, or maybe if you're listening, you might think, really, that doesn't sound right, right? That these are political figures, but that's not how they see it. And I think if you listen to Rogan, it's not really totally accurate, right? Rogan was a comedy guy. He called UFC fights. He was the host of Fear Factor, like one of the early reality shows, right? This was not like a Tucker Carlson or a Charlie Kirk. And, you see that a lot in that part of the media universe, right? Theo Von is a comedian. Andrew Schultz is a comedian. You see lots of these different people, and it was only things that kind of brought them over to politics gradually. And usually it kind of followed a pattern of interests to issues to elections. And I think that Democrats looking at that sometimes go in the opposite way, right? We're a party, we're often, especially at the kind of professional Democrat or staff level, it's a party of people who are political junkies. A core value of most Democrats is that politics is very important in people's lives. And one of the things we forget sometimes is just that obsession with politics, even if we think it's merited, can turn people off. It just tells people we don't see the world the same way. We're not listening to you. And so sometimes it's important to go the opposite way and say interests, then issues, and then elections and politics. And I will say, even since the book came out about a month ago, I've seen more and more Democrats doing this, not because of the book, but just because I think something is in the air where people are saying, hey, let's have some fun in public. These are serious times, but let's go out there and be interesting to engage with.
That was my next question, which is, we're in an attention economy, and one of the ways you get attention is fear. The other way is, frankly, through humor and being entertaining. And Democrats, it feels like we're just less funny than we used to be. And as someone who's made a career in Democratic politics and humor, like, do you feel like that's true? And if so, how do we find our way back to when there's really serious, heartbreaking, horrible things going on, still trying to engage people through humor?
Yeah, I think it is very challenging. I mean, I want to start by saying I don't have a sort of silver bullet and say, hey, here's how we can be funny, even though it is in many ways, these are not funny times, and I don't want to pretend that they are. At the same time, you use the word funny, and I think sometimes if it's just surprising, right? Surprising, interesting. I can point to a couple of examples of this recently. So, it's less jokes, right? It's more just doing something that is like, I didn't expect. Here's an example of, if you watch Hank Johnson, who's a congressman from Georgia, and full disclosure, my wife works on the court subcommittee on House Judiciary, so he's the chair of that subcommittee on the Democratic side. But I would say this anyway. He did a video recently. He's learning guitar, and he did a video about the Epstein files where he did a parody song about the Epstein files, and he kind of acknowledged, he was like, okay, I'm just going to give it a shot. But he looked very human doing it. And I think it was really winning because it's just like, he's being himself, right? I think that's the part. It took me a while to get there, actually, just as we're talking about it. But I think that's the biggest part, is being yourself in public is a skill. And I think it's a skill that Democrats, not all Democrats, but as a party, we got worse at, and we stopped acknowledging was important. And I think that's a really challenging thing, because we have to remember that being yourself in public, right? Like, candidates who can do that, they're going to have a leg up. And so if you're a candidate and you don't know how to do that, or you struggle to do it, you've got to work on it. And if you're sort of in the business of trying to figure out who should represent us, then I think that is an important quality in a candidate or a potential candidate.
Can you talk about that in the context of your own life? You're presidential speechwriter, consultant, you're thinking about running for office in the book. And yet you are willing to, in all your books, expose your nerves, your fears, your failures. And that's not a normal thing for a political staffer or someone who works in politics to do. Can you talk about both how you do it, how you got comfortable doing it, and maybe why it's a necessity right now?
Well, I'm not sure it's such a good idea. If I was saying what I really want to do more than anything else is run for office, writing a sort of revealing surf memoir where I talk about, among other things, frankly, like having a real episode of depression that kicked all of this off, not to mention a bunch of other things in the book, and getting personal in that way, I don't know that I'd recommend it.
Okay.
I think, it's good for a writer, but I'm not sure that it's the best way for someone who's aspiring to office. But I do think that one of the things I've learned, it's been interesting because, for when I was at the White House working as a speechwriter, you spend a lot of time watching people be themselves, watching principals. And President Obama obviously was really like a generational talent, both for in so many ways, but one of them was he was just like cool, right? Like, he was I'd write jokes for him. He had better timing than some of the comedians who were paid to deliver jokes, paid quite handsomely, right? So I think that's part of what was happening with all of this is I got to watch that. Then as I started writing books on a much, 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 much smaller scale, I had to do it, right? So you're doing a book talk or you're doing an interview or we're talking on this podcast. Nowhere near, orders of magnitude away from talking at the White House Correspondents' Center or something. And yet I could see how hard it was to try to be yourself when people are looking at you. And I don't know that I quite figured out what the key is, but I think there's two things I learned from that. One is a sense of grace, right? Like this is not easy, right? Like surfing, actually, people who are good at it make it look really easy. And so you think, oh, how hard could it be? Then you get up on a board and you say, oh, the answer is extraordinarily difficult, right? Like wildly hard. And the other thing that I think you see is that it can be learned. Also, frankly, like surfing, right? Like this is like learning to be yourself in public is something you can do. And I would say almost like anything in life, if you're trying to get better at it, find ways to practice it and find ways where it's not going to be disastrous if it goes badly. So that might mean practicing just if you're, if we're talking about politicians, it might mean practicing with your staff rather than doing everything on the internet, or it might mean acknowledging like, hey, this is going to be a little cringy, but I'm going to try it. Right. I think that's the other thing. Sometimes it's just a matter of, letting people know that, makes a huge difference, because if people know that, they feel like you're still guiding them, right? You're still, you still have some authority over the situation.
Any advice for, like, say we got a city council member listening or a state representative who's like, I got to be more open. I'm not going to lead with subpart 5 policy proposals, 5 policy white papers that people will have to follow. Any advice you can give them just as a professional?
Absolutely. So I would say have a pizza party. And here's what I think you should do at your pizza party. It doesn't have to be pizza, but it should, because everyone likes pizza. And it's also the New Jersey in me talking, right? Like, so you bring people together who, not just your staff, not just people who are professionally engaged in politics, but the kinds of people who you want to reach. And you try, if you don't know anyone you can reach out to, that's a problem in and of itself. And you should solve that problem too. And you do what I think of as like the lean in test, right? If you're telling stories, you're talking casual, but you keep real accountable track of when do people lean in because they want to hear more about what you're saying, and when do they kind of lean out, they start to check their phones, they suddenly say, oh, I need another slice of pizza, right? Like whatever the thing where people lose interest. And you will see there are going to be moments, and they're going to, some people, there's going to be tons of moments. Some people might just be 1 or 2, but there are going to be moments where people are leaning in, and there are going to be moments when they're leaning out. And I think it is your job to at least lead with a lean in moment when you're no longer just at your pizza party and you're talking to a broad group of people, you're on television, whatever, to start with something that grabs people's interest. And then from there, you have space and almost a license from the audience to talk about something else. When I wrote for President Obama, almost every time we went to a town that was not DC, right, we would go when we were on the road, we'd start by just saying, did a Chicago sports team play the local sports team? And then he would be like, hey, man, my Bears got, we got beat up. It was bad. And everyone in the audience is like, laughing, nodding, just they're not like that was hilarious, but they're just like, okay, I'm interested in that too, right? This is something that I was thinking about. And you just, you develop that skill. But it's not just, and I want to make one last point. This has been a long answer, but it's not just a matter of like relating to people. It's also a sign of respect, right? saying, I care about your interest, I care about your attention. There's a lot of good television these days, like so many streaming services, and you are watching me. So I'm going to try to make it worth your time, right? Like that immediately lets people know that you care about them. So it's not frivolous, right? You can't only do that, but it's not just a matter of entertaining. It's also a matter of demonstrating that you care about the people who you're talking to.
Yeah. I will say I was a young mayor and I was meeting President Obama, and he came over and he's like, there's a bunch of us standing there, and he's like, man, when'd you all get so young? Right. And it was like, for him, it was a throwaway line or just a easy observation. But for all of us, it was like, he noticed, like he cared, like, and you know, all of us would do anything forever for that man.
Well, let me add something else that I think was important there, because he also was very comfortable. He understood his own persona and he was kind of playing off it, right? So if he's come up and say, "Oh, when did you guys get so young?" Right? It was kind of him playing into this, like, I used to be the young guy, now look at my hair, right? And it's not rocket science, but it was saying, I understand who I am and I'm willing to play with it a little bit. And so again, like, we tend just to gravitate toward people who are self-aware. It's a quality in people, not just political people, that we admire. So I think that's important too. And to bring it back to the surfing for a moment, one of the things that I feel like I am better at because I started surfing is this sense of being comfortable with who I am in public, right? I don't mean I'm not a pro surfer. What I mean is, you go out to a break, and at first I would be frustrated because I'm like, oh, everyone in the water is better than me. And I just keep embarrassing myself. And over time, it was like, no, what I'm learning is how to own that, right? Like, to be comfortable with, yes, this is embarrassing, but I'm getting better. And I know, I know where I'm at. I know where I want to go. And I don't need other people to kind of be like validating me. I'm comfortable in my own skin. And once that happens, your surfing gets better. And I think it's the same kind of transformation that can make a big difference in your life.
This book has been out for about a month, and you're getting a lot of attention for it, as you should. What has surprised you about how it's been received, or the responses you're getting from folks as they read it?
I will say the biggest thing that surprised me was, well, I'll say one thing that I'm really happy about that didn't surprise me, but I was still nervous about, and then I'll say something that surprised me. I was really nervous more than anything else about what Matt would think about the book, because he didn't want to read it until it was too late to change it. And finally, I sent him a copy, or I didn't send him a copy. I brought him a copy. He was working here in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And I went over and brought him a copy. And, it was like watching him read the table of contents, and he just started laughing and being like, oh yeah, that was that trip we took to Santa Cruz, or like, that was that guy who, like, called me the snake, right? Like, all of these things. And where I was like, oh, he feels that this is our story, not just my story. And that's what I was going for. But at the same time, I was nervous about it, obviously. So that meant a lot to me. And then the second thing I would say that has surprised me more than anything, actually, is how well received the book has been by the surf community. I mean, you know this, Ryan, right? Like, surfers are not always the most welcoming bunch. They're not famously welcoming, and particularly new surfers, right? I was really nervous that, even though I took steps in the book to make it clear that I am not presenting myself as anything beyond like a beginner intermediate surfer, that people would be like, okay, this is like some guy who, took a surf lesson once and then wants to tell everybody about how he's this cool surfer dude. And there's some, I've been surfing long enough to understand that skepticism, even if I'm probably on the opposite side of it. And so the fact that, like, I've gotten to do stuff in like Surfer Magazine, or I did a podcast that the World Surf League runs, and they were really cool about it, where I was like, I get that I'm the worst surfer you've ever interviewed, but they're like, it's fine, right? Everybody, it's like the feelings that people have on a board, those are universal, even if some people are accessing those feelings, like, on like a double overhead day at Pipe, and some people are accessing them, like me, on like a 4-foot day or a 3-foot day on the Jersey Shore. And that was really cool. And again, like, I think this is, in some ways, it's a book about, at a time when it's really easy to just feel disappointed in people, right? Like, I think if you go on the internet, there's nonstop feeling disappointed in people. It's just like really nice to have examples of people who have like way more generosity of spirit than they need to. It's really cool.
Yeah. I gotta say, whenever I'm feeling down about the state of the world, one of the things I look at, frankly, is like I grew up in Santa Cruz, and I grew up with a lot of big name, soon to be professional surfers. And then I'm back and I have this high school surf team all around me, and they're actually like really nice kids. And
Yeah.
they like are trying to help, and like they're involved in environmental causes and other things. And I'm like, like I can see that the tangible difference in culture
Yeah.
that occurred over the past 40 years. And maybe this next generation will be okay and
Yeah.
save us.
Well, and something I think is cool about that too is, right, it's this idea of just wanting to be there for people in your life or wanting to be a helper, right? I feel like so many people in our culture and our politics are trying to politicize that idea. But over and over and over again, we're just reminded that like that basic human instinct to say, I could be cruel to someone and instead I'm going to treat them with kindness. I'm going to treat them with respect and like dignity and grace. Those are not partisan, certainly not among voters. And at the same time, they're like, it should be a reminder of what unites us, even at a moment when we are not united in very many ways. Because you're talking about those kids, for example, and it's like, no one knows, are those kids going to grow up and be Democrats or Republicans? That's so not the point in that moment. And I think that's something where like it can feel like everything is about, this kind of these fights. And I think to the extent we can remember, hey, like, I think about this a lot. We used to have like a lot of heroic first responders come to the White House and President Obama would tell their stories. And nobody ever once asked me, can you look into who they voted for? Or can you look into their political beliefs? Or did they ever say something mean about the president? It was like, that's not the point. These people are heroes, and that transcends all the pettiness of politics.
I love it. Although I got to say, one of the funniest scenes in your books are where you have the young surf instructors who are like, because I've experienced this 1,000 times of like, hey, you should just pop up and catch the wave. And like, that's the full extent of their teaching. And you're like, dude.
Yes. Ryan, I don't know if this is where you want to take this podcast, but I have so many thoughts about surf instruction. I think that a big part of it is that as you know, surfing until very recently and still to some extent was a sport where it's like, yeah, you just go learn, right? You just kind of get shoved into the water and you figure it out. And actually, that's not my temperamentally. I'm like, no, I'm going to research this. I'm going to like read 10 articles or whatever. And I'm much more of a like, I'll just figure it out kind of person than I used to be because of surfing, which I'm really grateful for. The thing I would say that for me was particularly strange about all of this. So when I started at the White House, I was 24 years old. I remember walking into a deputy chief of staff's office, and I had written a couple of speeches for her, but I hadn't done. We had never met. And she takes one look at me, and she turns to one of her aides, and she says, "Yeah, he's very young. This makes me uncomfortable." And I remember thinking, okay, well, this is going to be an interesting meeting, and it went fine. But I remember thinking, like, what are you talking about? I'm 24. I've been out of college for 2 whole years. I'm not young. And now, of course, I've got like 17-year-olds, and I'm like, all right, my life is in your hands. Teach me how not to drown. And the cool thing is that many of them really kind of did, right? Like a lot of the things that I took away from not just about surfing, but about life that I write about in the book really came from like a bunch of teenagers, sometimes teenagers who I was highly skeptical of. I remember one guy, he was like, the whole lesson, as you're saying, was like, if I fell off, he'd be like, you fell off. And I'd be like, that's not advice, right? That's just description. But after an hour of this, he says, you know what your problem is? You think too much, right? Like I'd rather see you go for the wave and miss it than hesitate because you're not sure if you're going to make it and then let it pass you by. And I was like, holy crap, my entire personality has just been diagnosed by this teenager. And it really stuck with me. And again, not just in the water, but also in the rest of my life where I was like, okay, how can I be more willing to commit without knowing everything?
I love that scene where he's like, this kid can diagnose the essence of you and all the mental struggles and everything else in a few minutes after watching you fall off surfboards a couple times. So it was a great moment. Listen, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today, and I want to thank you for writing this book. I encourage everyone, whether you're into surfing or not, to check out this book. It's as good a diagnosis of what's going on in our world and maybe a few ways out as anything I've read recently. So thank you.
Thank you. No, it's nice of you to say, and I'm really glad you liked it.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.